Hi,
Yay,
everybody.
April's here.
Hi, I'm so sorry for the delay. I had an issue with my internet, and so I had to reset my router real quick. So apologies for the delay on getting on here, but very happy to see everybody. So just give me 1 second here. I'm gonna pull up a couple things.
Okay, let me make you the co-host here.
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, it says that you're the co-host, so I assume that if you're going to share your screen, you should be able to do all that unless I have to just.
Perfect. Yep, looks like I have sharing abilities, so that's good. Okay. Okay. I think I should be good to go now. All right. So hi, everybody. My name is April White. I am the director of the G.W. Frank Museum of History and Culture in Kearney, Nebraska, for those of you who don't know. And I serve on the Nebraska Museums Association board as this is the assistant communications editor and distributor of the newsletter and stuff. So if you ever see the e-newsletter that comes out about once a month, that's what I put together and send out. So if you ever have anything, an event or something with your museum or any items you're wanting to like trade between anything with that you think other museums you could collaborate or benefit from, please send those my way and I will include them in our monthly newsletter and stuff. But to get started here, for today's monthly museum or monthly museum musings, we're going to be kind of discussing this idea of historical interpretation. And I can still remember when I first heard about historical interpretation, it was kind of this like really weird, vague, kind of enigma term that could mean a whole bunch of different stuff depending on who was, who was looking at it, who was getting their perspectives from it, just all these different things. And so today, hopefully, after we're done today, you'll have a little bit better understanding about what is historical interpretation, why is it important, and how can you implement it at your museum in ways that are fairly easy to do. Because most of us, are pretty short-staffed and limited on time and resources. So any way we can implement best practices for museums in ways that are easier is always beneficial. So I tried to put together a few things that would help. So I guess I'll kind of open it up here for discussion, because that's one of the best things about these monthly museum musings is we all get to collaborate and kind of discuss and benefit from each other's expertise and perspectives. So I'm going to just ask, like, what do you think historical interpretation is? Like, what do you think it means? And have you had any personal experience with it, or just what's your take on historical interpretation?
Okay, since nobody else is talking, unless you want to start, Erin.
Well, no, I have I'm kind of in the same boat as exactly what or how. I mean, it's the who, what, why, when, where, and how type of thing. I have examples where, like, for instance, we have a historic depot on our grounds, and right now I have it just set up as a depot, but it also has living quarters. To me, there's a whole bunch of different ways I could go. I mean, do I focus on just specifically that depot, or do I talk about all the railroads and the history of railroads and stuff like that? So I guess to me, it's so open to that word interpretation that, I mean, I could go in multiple different directions. And I guess it's just trying to rein in what to do. And I have so many other things. I mean, I have a historic house, I have a school, I have a church. So I have all these different things that I could work on, but it's what direction do I go? What direction do I head in? So, I mean, to me, it's a very open-ended question that I was actually thinking about this morning. So, yeah, so I just, to me, it's just such a widespread, concept that it could go almost any which way you wanted to go. And I think I mean, and I don't know, I don't want to say you couldn't do anything wrong, but technically you could, but just trying to figure out what direction to go in is, to me, the biggest mystery of them all. So if that I assume that falls into what you're thinking of. And so it's just such a wide open thing that I don't have. How do I narrow it down?
And to build off of, oh, sorry, April.
No, go ahead, Kelly.
Okay. I'm gonna say, to build off of that, I also look at it, telling the story from more than just one perspective. There is one, in Nebraska earlier, this year, I saw a sign interpreting an event from only one perspective. There are two groups of people there, but this sign only interpreted it from the one side. It did not look at the perspectives of the other side and what happened to that event. And I think looking for a more complete story too can be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And Erin, that's what you kind of talked about, is what so many people find, kind of, it's hard to grasp this idea of what historical interpretation is, because it can be very intimidating with how many possibilities are available, which it's our job. And we always, like Kelly said, we always want to tell as many perspectives and all the full story. We want to tell everybody's whole truth as much as possible. And that really is kind of what interpretation boils down to, is, and literally the definition of interpretation, if you look it up in the dictionary, it's just basically the act of giving meaning to something. So it's like, it's super vague, but so when you put historical in front of it, it becomes this idea of, okay, how do then we give meaningful interpretation and stories? How do we give meaning to the history that's available at our various museums? Like Erin, you talked about, you have all these different buildings, and at our museum, we have multiple different stories and histories, and it's our job to try and give meaning to them. And so, but it's this idea of like, so how do you do that? Like, what does it mean to give meaning to something, because my perspective is going to be completely different from like a Latinx immigrant, or a person who comes from ancestry of formerly enslaved people, or even a wealthy white person from the eastern states or something. My perspective is going to be very different. So how can we be sure to interpret things not only by telling all these stories, but very responsibly? And probably one of the best ways you can do that is collaboration, is reaching out to the people literally affected. So like Erin, if you have a schoolhouse, it would be beneficial to maybe talk to a teacher who's been retired, or maybe had a mother who was a teacher at a one-room schoolhouse, and maybe they can offer some perspectives, because that's probably the most important part, is gaining those perspectives as a way to interpret. And so essentially, it's this idea of like, how do we present our exhibits in a meaningful way? How do we communicate our collection to visitors to make their visit beneficial, meaningful, and most of all, not boring? Because one of the best examples of why historical interpretation is important is like, let me see if I can find it here. So while I'm looking this up, does anybody else want to discuss like why you think historical interpretation is important? I know we've kind of already touched on it, but does anybody else have any other ideas, input about why personally they think that this kind of making sure we don't just present fact, we don't just present a collection of information, we don't just set an object out and say what it is, we have to provide context. And so why, like as museum people, why is it important? That's my question for everybody right now, is why is it important to, do historical interpretation?
I would say that it's important because, like you said, they need context. The audience needs context. The audience needs us to kind of, a lot of the times we come at this from a very academic, very like complex angle when we're setting things up, when we're doing research. And the public doesn't necessarily need all of that or want all of that. So what we have to do is we have to take that and we have to summarize it in a way that's engaging, but still educational. And I think that's what interpretation is and why it's important. It's because it's taking all of this information that we've scrounged up and making it palatable and understandable for the audiences that we're trying to reach out to. Not necessarily palatable as in like dumbing it down or hiding facts, just like making it easy to understand, and kind of removing that gatekeeping element that sometimes happens in academic settings, often accidentally.
I think that last point you made is really important, where sometimes, and we can't all be, 100% on our game all the time. So we are going to, but it's our job to like continually check in kind of with ourselves and just, make sure we're utilizing our critical thinking skills and those critical thinking perspectives so that we can try and avoid that as much as possible. But we have to also be very, forgiving to ourselves. We have to go easy on ourselves, knowing that even as professionals, we're still going to not knock it out of the park every single time, or, you know, hit it on the nose every single time. And so then, but it's our job to always learn from those possible mistakes and, try and just use that even as another critical perspective, as a way to look at things from different angles. So anybody else have any other want to talk about like why you think historical interpretation would be important, like at your institution? And be thinking like about your audiences and things like that.
I like what you said, April, about putting things in context. It's, it isn't very helpful if you go to a museum and just say what it is. I may not understand what that object is, so you can tell me that's the name, but I don't understand, how it was used, who used it, and what, I might understand it might be, like an agricultural implement or a household item, or, something like that, but I don't really understand what it is until, you've explained it a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. That's pretty much exactly like why that's exactly it. Like historical interpretation not only provides the what and the when and all that stuff, but it provides the why. Like, why is this important? What is the bigger story? Because if you just have it's this idea that to always keep in the back of your head, this idea that objects alone do nothing. They don't do anything. They don't you might have a very beautiful tapestry, but it kind of is like just that initial like, oh, that's pretty, and then that's it. Like nobody really, but if you can tell this story about how the tapestry came to your museum and talk a little bit about the personalities of the people who maybe put it together and why, people start to connect. And when they start connecting with these objects, then they start to care. That's the point. If you can get people to care about history and make a real emotional connection of some kind beyond just the intellectual, because emotional connections always hit deeper than just purely intellectual and fact-based ones. So if you can make people have an emotional connection to an object, that's always the end goal with historic interpretation, is to make people connect and in ways that are more than just, this is a pretty tapestry or that's a beautiful bowl. You know, something that's aesthetically pleasing is always nice. We as human beings always appreciate, you know, aesthetics and things like, and design and things like that. But if you can connect with them on a way that maybe they can identify with it as well, like, you know, just in any way you can think of, people love those stories. And so basically, yeah, without this interpretation, it's just this disconnected facts. And again, context is always one of my favorite things with history. I think all of us are. And I think even as historians, it's kind of this joke where it's tough for us to even tell stories. Like if my husband, for example, asks me, you know, like, where did this book come from? You know, I have to provide like all the context all the way back to like when I had the idea a week ago to go buy this book, you know, and so by providing all that context, I feel like I'm making the book more meaningful. So eventually, if you do it long enough, you do start actually doing it in your everyday life. And then it just kind of becomes second nature to want to do historical interpretation instead of just present a bunch of objects. And so that's what I kind of wanted to show here, is this old idea of what the very first museums were called a cabinets of curiosities, curiosity cabinets. And this is a drawing of a incredibly old cabinet of curiosity. It's one of the very first ones in Europe, and it dates all the way back to 1599, you know, like, and so you can see if you were to walk into this place, like this is what these, I mean, this is a drawing, obviously, because they didn't have photography back then. But you can just see that, like, it's interesting, but why on earth would anybody care about any of this stuff? Like, why would you ever, first of all, why would you ever go back? Second, why is this, like, a lot of people, especially today, they want to ask this question of, how does this relate to me? Like, and why would I care? And so that also goes back into that idea of those multiple perspectives and making sure to include as many stories as possible so we can reach the widest audience possible. And then so here's another one. I mean, us personally, I think we have a better appreciation for a lot of cabinet curiosities, but a lot of museums for a long time really resembled these kind of cabinet of curiosities, where you literally just display your entire collection with maybe a small label denoting what it is and the date, but no connection. Like, there's no story being told here. There's no meaning. And this is why a lot of, especially young people, like elementary school age, tweens, early teens, things like that, it's difficult to get them interested in museums and history when you present something that looks like this. They might think it's kind of cool and weird, but they don't really connect with the historical aspect and understand why it's important. And it's hard to take stuff away from this. So our job is to turn it. And so here, I'm going to show you one more. If anybody's ever seen like the Treasure of the Czars exhibit, it's a phenomenal exhibit that traveled around. I think it's stationed somewhere now, I think in Las Vegas, maybe, I'm not sure. But when they first started presenting, you know, the czars in Russia, they had this huge, all of their stuff, all of their plates, everything was like over the top opulence. But their story is incredibly fascinating. But when they first started presenting a lot of their stuff to the public, it just looked like this. It was just tables full of stuff, like stuff that a lot of regular people couldn't connect to, because this stuff was considered so opulent and different from what they were used to. And yeah, it's beautiful. And I've been to the exhibit once, and it's aesthetically stunning. But what they do now today is they present it more like this. They present it more like this, where they actually have not only the objects, but they have not just the pretty stuff. They have text accompanying the objects that the visitors can read and get a little bit of sense of what they're looking at. It's our job to show people and tell them what they're looking at. We're all very familiar with the objects in our collections, but visitors aren't. So it's our job to teach everything we kind of know about an object in just a few minutes. And so to do that, you not only provide text, but you provide photographs, additional text, just as much context as possible, and to accompany the, so that way people start saying, like, they can start picturing somebody wearing this. They can start picturing this on somebody's wall. They can start getting a sense of the person who owned this object. They can get a sense of their personality and maybe why were they interested in this object and that kind of stuff. So we can build characters of these historic people that people can care about, because as human beings, we love stories. We always have. We love stories. We love complex characters that are more than just, you know, historical figures in a black and white photograph that are just standing there. We can create, excuse me, we can create lots of just stories, and that's kind of the most important part. So does anybody want to talk about like instances maybe where they've been to a museum and just found it kind of boring and why, or why they've been to a museum that wasn't boring and they absolutely loved it and why? Does anybody have any examples, or even from your own institutions? Do you have any examples?
I guess my least favorite museums are ones where, yeah, they just set stuff out and just say like fork, you know, like, okay, well, yes, I mean, it's a silly example because we know what a fork is, but you know, if you're from a culture that doesn't understand what a fork is, how would they have any idea who used it, why they used it, where they used it? So I like having, yes, interpretation to help me understand what those objects are. But then I've also been to places where there's just so much information and I have been completely overwhelmed. Like museum fatigue sets in right away. And then I have to realize, well, yeah, this might be great information, but I can only, you know, read part of it because I'm just, my brain is getting so full of information. So I think to me, the best ones have a nice mix of, yep, here's our cool object and here's some interpretation, but I'm able to go through the entire thing and learn without just being completely overwhelmed or underwhelmed, either one.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I actually love the fork example because we had the Frank Museum is technically a historic house, and they've done just amazing things throughout the history. And we can't really place blame and be anachronistic on people in the past, especially museum directors from the 1970s and 1980s, who maybe didn't have professional training and they were just kind of trying to, you know, do the best they could with what they had and stuff. So we have to give them credit for that. But yeah, there was one exhibit and we have photographs from it where it was literally just they invited the public to bring all of their flatware and just lay it out on tables in the museum. There was no interpretation, no information, and people just walked around and looked at sets of silverware. And some of them were very ornate and beautiful, but a lot, unless you're specifically very interested in fancy silverware, it just doesn't, you know, a lot of people. But if you talk about like your great grandmother and maybe put a label up that says my great grandmother escaped persecution in Europe and brought this silverware with her, then the object then becomes meaningful. And it's like, oh, this is connected to like some real drama in history, you know. And so if we can even provide just a little bit of context instead of just being like, yeah, this is a fork, like it provides a much more rich visitor experience. And yeah, and we always have to kind of think of that fine balance between too much information and not enough information. So just I found the best kind of recipe for it is if you have an exhibit you want to do, one large main text label that maybe has 150 to 200 words on it, and then a few smaller labels throughout as people move through the exhibit. to correspond with, maybe if you want to highlight a very important artifact or provide a little more context along with the document. But those smaller labels, you have to keep the text under 100 words on those smaller labels. Otherwise, yeah, it's going to be too much, because you also want people to, you not only just want to provide the information, but you want people's minds to start working and imagining and thinking on their own, like without us holding their hands, the whole time. And so it's kind of this fine balance. So as museum people, it's not that difficult to just provide like one main label and then a few smaller labels throughout, but paired with, specific stuff you want to showcase. And then you can provide other artifacts along with stuff that maybe just have, then you can just put like, this is a teapot from whenever, but you have that one teapot within a lot of context. So that's where you don't have to provide and do extensive, exhaustive research on every single thing and present that. It's just kind of, and always kind of think like, if you think it's interesting as a story, your audience is going to think it's interesting as a story too. Have, faith in your own expertise, and remember that you are professionals and you're the expert of your collection for sure. So it's always, but yeah, that's a good point. Does anybody else have any other examples of museum exhibits they've absolutely loved, or ones they've just been like, ones you can't really even, you remember visiting, but you really don't even remember anything that was in it? Because I have a few like that where I'm like, I don't really remember much of what was in there. I remember it was a lot of stuff, but I don't really remember why it was there or anything like that. But does anybody else have any other examples of museums they've just absolutely loved to visit, or exhibits, traveling exhibits, or ones they've just really not cared for?
So, well, being a museum person, I of course love visiting museums, and so I kind of like you, April. I have many museums that I've visited, and I couldn't tell you a thing about what I saw. There might have been one or two things. I mean, I visited one historic house museum, and I was just impressed by the closets and because of how they were situated, and then the fact that on the staircases, the landings, they had checkerboard patterns, and the little intern who was going through with me mentioned that the kids like to play checkers on the checkerboard pattern. And then I think that somewhere on display was a tea set that was from once used at the White House, but I cannot tell you the name of the house. I know where it is, and I can't tell you who lived there, but those are the little things that I remember, but then on the other end, I just visited a house a couple years ago, and I can tell you where it is. It's in Kansas, but it's a historic house, but they don't have exhibits. Basically, these two sisters lived there until they died, and they were like 93 and 98 when they died, and the house is almost untouched from when they left. So there aren't exhibits. It's just you will walk in and it's like somebody's still living there. And the guide is actually the one who gave us more of the information. I mean, there's no labels on anything, but he mentioned, okay, well, there's a chair over there that Teddy Roosevelt sat in, and if you want to sit in Teddy Roosevelt with the same chair, go ahead. Or he pointed out in the dining room where the mother of the household, she was a teetotaler, so she didn't serve any alcohol, but at her chair and her spot, there's a secret button on the floor that would buzz the servants to tell them when the next course was ready. So, so they don't really have any sort of interpretation. They've just left the house as it is. And it's the Sealy house in Abilene, if anybody's curious, but it's just very interesting. But their interpretation is no interpretation, if you will, I guess. They've just left it as is. So I guess that's another whole, interesting concept, if you will. There's interpretation out back in the former carriage house, because the guy who built the house made his money through patent medicine. So, which is interesting because it's mostly alcohol, and yet mom was a teetotaler. So, but just the stories that were told, and I don't know how I don't think they could do it any better, because just the story. I mean, I don't think they allow just people to wander in and out. I think you have to have a tour or whatever, but that really just sticks in my mind just by based on what they've pointed at, what they point out, and the stories that they tell, and just how impressive this house is and everything behind it. So
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, Erin, about how some places they're just frozen in time, and you actually don't really want to change anything because like it is like a preserved moment in time, and you can literally walk through there and it's exactly as it was 100 years ago. It's literally like stepping back in time, which is a valuable thing. But in that case, instead of like putting up a bunch of labels and then, you know, professional exhibits that would disrupt the space, then you can, yeah, you can have your tour guide provide good stories and things like that. I think it's funny that the few ones that you pointed out that you remembered from those exhibits and those museums you visited were that you always use the word interesting. Like I thought that was interesting. And it's like, yes, that's if even if you don't have labels, the tour guides can provide the information. They can be, you know, the walking label, if you will, or the interpretation. The tour guide can provide the interpretation without having to disrupt the historical space. And so that's one reason why historical interpretation can be kind of this weird enigma, because there's so many ways to go at it. And yeah, it's like I always think of has anybody ever been to the J. Sterling Morton Mansion in Nebraska City? It's a amazing building, but it is one of those that's just frozen in time, and it's kind of a cabinet of curiosities a little bit, but the only two parts I remember are the bowling alley in the basement, because the tour guide actually provided some like interesting story about it. The rest of it was just, this was their bedroom, this is their bathroom, this is their hallway. Like it was just, there wasn't a lot. And I think they've made it, I haven't been there in years and years, but and then I remember the bathroom with like the weird toilet that it had, because the tour guide actually talked about the weird toilet. Like, and so it's like the few parts, but it's like a 4-story mansion, huge, but those are the only two things I really remember about it, because the tour guide actually provided some context. So there are ways to just, you know, even if you have more of a cabinet of curiosity style museum, you can have your tour guides provide the interpretation and the context without having, if you're just don't have a lot of time and you just don't have a lot of effort to completely rehaul an exhibit. Because I know a lot of us out here in Nebraska and the Midwest are dealing with that lack of resources to do that. So, all right. So Cassie, Tara, and Sherry, we haven't really heard from you guys too much. I'd like to hear a little bit of your perspectives on any part that we've talked about so far. If you'd like to contribute, you don't have to if you don't feel like it, but I just want to make sure we hear from everybody today while we're here.
I just came to see Audrey. Hi, Audrey.
Hi, hi,
kidding.
Terry. It's so good to see you.
That's a great reason. That's a phenomenal reason.
Good to see you.
Yeah, well, I got this email and I didn't even know this was taking this museum takes place. So I thought I would jump on. We don't have a lot of opportunities in the Children's Museum, but I'm always looking for ways, and we obviously have to like really go a step further, because the hands-on and the way in which, you know, what we can allow them to, you know, experience and things like that. But I just kind of wanted to get the perspective from that standpoint and just see what I could take further as we're trying to yeah, go a little deeper in what the kids are doing when they're in our exhibits.
I think that's great. Yeah, I think that's a great example of how you really have to think of like, what is your museum's purpose and who is your audience? Those are the two big things when doing historical interpretation. Because yeah, kids aren't going to find like the Russian Tsar exhibit with the labels and the clothes and everything displayed. The kids aren't going to really connect with that. And that's, I mean, you might have a few, but they connect more, yeah, with like hands-on interactives. And hands-on interactives actually are a form of interpretation, because you're allowing them to interpret these objects in ways that are, exciting and relevant to them rather than just presenting information. So, but yeah, that's a good example of always be aware of like your museum's purpose and who your audience is when you're doing historical interpretation, because those are very important.
Yeah, I guess when I sit out in front of the museum, it's kind of interesting to see the kids versus the older generation. Because when you first walk in, it shows you like this is what it was for kids in the 1920s or through the Great Depression or through the drought. Your older guests will come in and say, oh yeah, like, I've heard stories or I remember, but little kids, they don't understand at all. They see the pictures of what was happening to children in the 1920s and they can't grasp it. They have to have you tell them a story or tell them, well, this is what was happening. Immigrants were coming into the country and they didn't have jobs, they didn't have homes, and you have to explain all of that to children. And so it is neat to see how between children and adults, just even their perspectives of it. So yeah, so we change our stories up a lot for just the kids too.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a really good point of seeing how you can even adjust your stories. Because yeah, that's what I do at my museum is we provide free tours of the whole museum. But yeah, my tour for a group of retired teachers is very different from the tour I provide to a group of 10-year-olds. It's going to be very, very different. And so I usually try, and yet, like you said, when you try and explain to them like the immigrants coming in, they didn't have homes. And so you have to tell the kids, like, try to imagine what it would be like living in your house with 10 other people you don't know, that or in a house that didn't have air conditioning or heating, and you'd be so cold at night, and try and get them to like, tactile. It's a lot of like, I found that kids respond to a lot of like tactile examples, even if they can't touch anything. But if you can try and imagine to get them to not emotionally feel like, we're not trying to do a Jacob Riis, how the other half lives kind of connection so much, but more of like, what you have today, imagine if you didn't have that, or imagine what it would feel like waking up, getting out of bed and putting your feet on dirt floors, that kind of like sensory, I guess sensory is a good word to connect with young kids. And that's why probably, the children's museums have so much hands-on stuff, that sensory connection, because that's what a lot of kids will take away from these museums is they remember touching stuff. They remember the colors, they remember that kind of like sensory stuff. So you can play on their senses of sound, feel, sight, smell. You can even do smell if you want. I've been to museums where you walk into like the kitchen area and it smells like bread is baking, and it really like makes you it really makes a difference in some ways. So anybody else want to add anything about like your institution and how you've tried to do historical interpretation, or think about your audience, or do you have a different audience, or is there something that I haven't talked about that you'd like me to that you want to discuss?
Well, April, I'm going to jump in here.
Yay.
I didn't plan it, but I've been streaming a program that's on PBS. And I can't remember its name. It's something called like the Met at 150 or something. So it's about the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. So I thought, oh, this would be kind of interesting. Oh my gosh, I cannot recommend this to you highly enough to watch. It's a 3-episode program. I've only done the first 2. And the whole point is the Met, thanks to the pandemic, is having to absolutely pivot how they interpret. It is all about interpretation. And the thing that I was just stunned about was that when they reopened after 4 months of being closed, and you do remember New York City was the hotbed when COVID first hit, they had no tourists. They only had New Yorkers, which is how they started. And so the idea of who is our audience totally changed. And there's one incident I will share with you that they have the famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. And then they asked, this had already been in the works just before the pandemic hit, but they did ask an African-American artist to do an interpretation of this. So he made a very contemporary, it's a huge painting. I mean, like takes a whole wall. And so he did a mural, 2 murals, and it was very clear that it interpreted that incident, that crossing the Delaware, from Indigenous people's perspective. It's very fascinating. But the whole idea is bringing in artists, bringing in people, as you've been saying. And I actually thought that most of the museums in Nebraska would be easier to do this than what it is at the Met. Such a huge battleship, I don't mean it negatively, to have to try and turn. But they are doing it. And here, because we're smaller, and they had to raise $150 million. They let off 20% of their staff during the pandemic. So, but I think everything is just a matter of scale. What is a $100 problem to one museum is a $100 million problem to another museum, but it's just as hard to get those resources for whatever your budget size may be. But at any rate, because we are such a part of our communities, it is really easier for us to speak to our communities through the interpretation. So I just commend that program to you. I learned a tremendous amount. There's one of a woman, of an African-American woman with her 2 daughters, and they went into the 18th century galleries, which of course shows lots of portraits of what? Men. And so here she is with her 2 daughters. And, we just take these things for granted because this is all great art, but it goes to absolutely every type of collection. So I just commend this program to you. For those of us who maybe don't need to read all the time, but maybe to see it visually. But again, that sense of who is the audience and how can we relate to them? And there is not one audience. There are many, many audiences. And to try and tell the story from their perspective. The one thing you all haven't mentioned at all is with the interpretation is how can you prolong the interpretation through digital?
That
The
kind
old
of
labels, yeah, that's good, but is there some way you can provide more information?
I guess that kind of goes into some of my thoughts is that, so the audience, there are many different audiences, but especially for our historical museums, we're getting further and further away from our origins. We're adding more history, and it's great that we're incorporating more viewpoints, which we should have, of course, been doing since the beginning. But when like our museum first started, our first founders, they had memories of the tools that were being used or their parents used them. Well, now we're 2 or 3 or 4 generations away from that. And it's not that it's harder to tell that story, but we have to be coming up with more ways to relate that story to this new generation. 20 years ago, I could point out a Victrola and say, hey, that's like an old record or a CD player. Kids don't know what a CD player is anymore, so we have to change up what we can compare it to, so we're getting further, telephones. I mean, a telephone is a great example. You know, you see it on Facebook and the internet, you know, millennials or whatever the generation is called now. I haven't got a clue anymore, you know, trying to dial on a rotary phone, you know, that type of thing. So one thing that we have to do is, in terms of maintaining that interpretation, is we have to keep up with how things are changing, you know. Yeah, we can say so-and-so, you know, grew up in a log house. Well, how many of the kids now have even a concept of what a log house was, you know, or have that type of thing? We just have to make sure that we can interpret it on a level that they are able to understand, if I'm making sense, you know, that type of thing. We just need to make sure that we are also keeping up with of how interpretation and, you know, the different groups that are coming in. You know, if we have a group that's, you know, in an area where a new immigrant group is coming in, well, how do we interpret for them if their group has never been in our area before? How do we relate to them with our, you know, whereas 20 years ago we didn't have to, you know. So we just kind of have to keep up with that interpretation. Not that we have to completely do a 180, but maybe in some cases we do have to do a complete, you know, change what we're doing. So
Absolutely. And I think what you said is really important. And I think it really connects with what Audrey was talking about, how we can look to other institutions to see what they're doing. Because if the Met is actually like prioritizing interpretation and focusing on their audience, it's a really good indicator that that's something it's the future of museums. It's not just preservation and presenting and researching. It's literally, we have to think about our audiences. And one way we can do that and like reach out to, and like, yeah, how do we connect with these younger generations? Because I also part-time teach, and yeah, trying to tell people, like, in my opinion, when I talk about World War II and I tell the story of how Clark Gable was in, you know, the war and stuff, they look at me and they're like, who the hell are you talking about? They don't know what I'm talking about. To me, it's like really interesting. So you have to kind of like, you know, or go like, it's like you said with the Vitrola thing. It's like we can almost start putting CD players in museums as artifacts. You know, it's getting to that point. And so yeah, there's really easy ways to put if you go online, there's tons of programs and apps and all kinds of stuff available to actually put together surveys that you can send out. If there's like if I want to connect more with our diverse students, I would reach out to UNK's Office of Diversity and Inclusivity, maybe have a meeting with their leader and be like, you tell me how I can better present this information, rather than, because like Audrey pointed out, you know, a lot of those portraits are of men. And so it's like that perspective, it's like they were promoting what they believed was important, rather than asking, what does your audience actually want? You know, so because and we have to humble ourselves as well and try and be as humble as we can, which I think we're all pretty good at and we enjoy doing, because, you know, my favorite part, the reason I love historical interpretation so much, is because it's the whole reason why we do what we do, to try and convince people that aren't us that what we're doing is important, and what we're showing you and telling you in our history and collection is important. And so historical interpretation helps us do that. But yeah, there's ways to like I would, again, maybe reach out to the Office of Diversity and Inclusivity on UNK's campus and maybe like, can I send out, because they have email lists for like all of the you know, Chinese students. They have all of the from Saudi Arabia. They have with the Oman ministry, they have email lists for these students specifically. And that's just one example. So maybe I could put together a small questionnaire of like, what would you like to see at the museum? What would be interesting to you? Or, you know, you could do it to your local high schools and see, it might be a cool activity for a history teacher at a high school to do with their students, and be like, let's go to the museum. And then you write about what you liked and what you didn't like at the museum. And then the history teacher could send it to you and you could read through it. There's ways to connect with people and maybe that kind of stuff. And I always try and hire young students so that I can be like, does anybody want to do the Twitter page? Because I know you guys can do it better than I can. So stuff like that. Just try and, literally go directly to the source, I guess, is is a good thing. And it goes back to that whole idea of collaboration is key, and not just collaboration within your institution and getting people's ideas and working with your own people, but collaborating outside of your museum. Like if you're going to do a farming exhibit or an exhibit on like the history of agriculture, go to a farmer and ask them, like, go to several and ask, like, what would you like to see? Like, is this information connecting with the farming community? Because you definitely don't want to insult anybody if you can help it, but sometimes you can't help it. And again, it goes back to the whole idea of, nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. So, but mainly, yeah, I mean, we got a few minutes left here. So does anybody else want to say anything? Sherry, did you have anything that you wanted to talk about, or Autumn, or anybody want to add any last things here? And then I have a few last things I just want to try and leave with you before we sign off here.
Sorry, I haven't been able to be involved. It's been a revolving door and phone calls and requests and people coming, and I just have to keep jumping up. So missed most of it. Nice to see you all though.
We completely trust me. All of us here, I think all of us completely understand. And it's why the idea of this, and Sherry, you make a good point of like, we don't always have the time and hours to dedicate to just like thinking about how can we make our museum more interpretive. That's almost a luxury to be able to do that. And a lot of us don't have the time, because we wear so many hats and we're doing so many different things. And so there's easy ways to do it, and the things that we can do is we can try and brain train ourselves in a way where just every time you look at an object, or every time you look at, your exhibits, or you think about historical information, just always keep that question in your head of why. Why is this important? Why do we want to put it on display? Why on earth would anybody besides me care about this? Like, just keep those why questions, and eventually it'll become second nature. And as things become second nature in our heads, it makes it easier down the road. It just becomes like part of the process of doing stuff and being a museum worker. Just kind of that, if you just kind of brain train yourself to always think why is this, why is that important, why is that, what is the context here, kind of stuff. Why is it meaningful? What is there a story? That kind of stuff. If you can just always, with everything, that historical interpretation does, it just comes down to the why on earth would anybody care about this if they come in and look at it and stuff like that. So, and just always remember, people usually don't remember just cold fact. They remember stories, and they remember emotions. They remember those things. Those things will stick with them for a long time. People love a good story, they love good drama. And so if you can create any sort of stuff like that, that's always a good thing to do. But yeah, that would be what I would leave with, is just always be thinking of that why. Why is this important? Why would anybody care about this object or this story or this information? How, that kind of stuff. So all right, well, that's pretty much all I had for everybody today. This was really great. Thank you, everybody. And does anybody else have anything else they want to add, or just talk? We can just casually talk about whatever. Doesn't have to be a historical interpretation. It's just nice to see everybody. So anybody have any exciting news or anything from their institutions? That's all right. Sometimes no news is good news in these times. Sometimes it's like, oh, just nice to have kind kind of quiet, kind of nice. That kind of stuff.
We did open the Father Flanagan Visitor Center in Ballymo, Ireland Saturday.
Oh,
So
that's great.
yes.
Oh, that's
So
awesome.
Tom is over there. They opened it Saturday. And of course they're staying for the game. So but yes.
Nice.
So
Where-
the new Father Flanagan Visitor Center is opened. So
That's so great. That's really wonderful.
yeah, that's
Congratulations.
exciting.
That is very exciting. Yeah, my mother actually knew Father Flanagan, and she just has nothing but wonderful things to say about him. So that's really great. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
They figured since 30,000 Nebraskans were going over, that would be a good time to open it.
yeah, that's a good. That's a good. See, again, thinking about the audience. Very
Yeah.
good.
There you go.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you everybody so much for being here. Yeah, I didn't get to say thanks, Autumn. I saw her chat and everything. So thank you everybody for coming. This was I really enjoyed talking with everybody. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out anytime. So other than that,
And this
yeah,
was
that's all.
recorded, so this will be on the website. I'm not entirely sure how fast that she gets them on the website. So, and I can't remember what the next one is. Do you remember what the next one is, April?
Let me look here real quick. I can hop on here real quick. Our next one is going to be in October.
Oh,
Or
there's
September. Sorry, September. Ugh, September.
The October one is going to be on like the paranormal. I know that one.
Yes. The next one is September. The October one's going to be paranormal investigations. So that should be pretty interesting. And then the next one is September 23rd. Same time, same place, and it's going to be DIY preservation. So it's kind of it's going to be hosted by Jessica Noyd, the registrar at the Hastings Museum. So that'll be I think that'll be a beneficial one for a lot of us who are on a budget, on a very strict budget. It's easy to do historic preservation, just kind of DIY rather than ordering a bunch of stuff from Gaylord and all that kind of stuff. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you all
Thanks,
so much.
April.
and Thanks.
Thank you,
and-
April.
Hey, thank
Yeah,
you, April.
absolutely.
You've done a great job of keeping
Yeah, hopefully
this
everybody
going.
kind of has a little bit better idea about it's still just kind of like historic interpretation can still be like, so what? Like it still can be kind of in that, but it's just, you just have to kind of just, as long as you're presenting the why in the story, you're winning. It's a win. So so you don't have to get too bogged down in I mean, there's courses and PhDs dedicated to historical interpretation. So it's a big deal, but yeah. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I had a wonderful time. So please reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you.